Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to the third of our webinar series this year on looking at environmental sensitive areas and environmental considerations related to oil spill preparedness and response. So welcome again to everyone. If you've been following our webinar series, thank you very much. I hope you've been enjoying the series. So this is the last for this year. My name again is Marisol Estrella. I work with the UN Environment Program in the Disasters and Conflicts branch based here in Geneva. I oversee a collaboration that we have with the government of Norway in strengthening environmental management in the oil and gas sector in a number of countries. So welcome, I'd like to welcome the panel and our team to this webinar, which I think will be a very interesting discussion based on all the experiences from our panel members. Just a little bit of background to why we are doing this and what we are, what space we engage in this area. So I mean, as you know, of course, I mean, you know, we're all focused on ensuring that countries promote the energy transition, and we are moving slowly away from the use of fossil fuels. But we also recognize that there is still need for the use of oil and gas in certain sectors, and this will still take some time for countries to transition in an equitable and sustainable way to other alternative energy sources. And this is why UNEP is continuing to also support, together with the government of Norway, a number of countries, especially in Africa, on how to better manage, regulate, and ensure environmental safeguards are in place with regards to oil and gas development and oil and gas activities. And one of those risks that we really focus on is on potential acute pollution incidents such as oil spills. So this is why we have brought you this webinar series for this year, focusing specifically on the environmental considerations related to oil spills and also oil spill incidents in environmentally sensitive areas. So welcome again once more. What we will do, so welcome, we have now over 100 people on the platform, so welcome to everyone. We will start, this webinar will actually be focusing on the response side of the oil spill incidents. Like webinar one focused on the policy frameworks and regulations at both the international level and country level. The second webinar focused on the environmental sensitivity mapping and its role in helping to inform oil spill preparedness and response. And so now this third webinar will be focusing on actual response methods and strategies, and especially in environmentally sensitive areas. And we'll be looking at methods and approaches of how to incorporate environmental considerations to inform response options on the ground. So without further ado, I think we are ready to call up our first presenter, and I will introduce our speakers in turn as they come up to present. But just to introduce very briefly, we have Mr. Paul Krause, who is a principal officer in Ramboll. We have Dr. Conor Bolas with us from ITOPF, and Rune Bergstrøm from the Norwegian Coastal Administration. So I hope you will be very forthcoming with all of your questions, which you can put in the question box. As you can see that there is a question box in your dashboard, and you can type in your questions there, and I will draw questions after we finish all the presentations. So again, let me now call Rune. Rune works for the Norwegian Coastal Administration. He has over 40 years of experience in nature conservation projects, environmental response, and research. And he's presently the incident commander and staff of the director at the Norwegian Coastal Administration. He has a master's in ecology from the University of Oslo and has been appointed as a board member of the Svalbard Environmental Protection Fund. So Rune, please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you. I will start my presentation. Okay, can everyone see my presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I would like to give this speech from the incident commander's view, because very often you have to, when you speak about environmental issues, you normally go into the environmental unit in all oil response organizations. But it is very important that the incident commander and what sort of different information, what different sort of topics he or she has to deal with. That's also very important to understand when you're dealing with how to protect the environment in the best possible way. So all oil spill accidents, or most of them, they always start with a search and rescue operation. So always we start to save life. It's a ship or whatever that is in danger. We have to save the life and health of the people that's involved in the accident. And when passengers and crew are safe, then it's. Did you lose my presentation? No, I did.
See it.
Yeah.
Yes, we see it.
I need to. Okay. Then you need to start the planning the oil spill action. You have to also start the mobilization of all the equipment you need. And you should always try to start as soon as possible, because the final result is all when there's oil spill, be there as early as possible, get the equipment, start to collect oil as early as possible. That is because oil is drifting fast, and when it spreads, it's really hard to catch up with it again. So the more concentrated you can attack the oil, the more oil you actually can gather, and the less is the damage to the environment. Or what very often happens in the start of an oil spill operation is that people are, of course, very focused on operation, on logistics, and in our organization, I get in very many other countries, there's a lot of people with naval background, things like that. They're very focused on getting the ships and all the fleet getting out there. And in that picture, it's very important that you don't forget why you're doing all this. It is to protect the environment. So you can get very caught up in why that ship doesn't get out there, why it should be there later, why we don't get the equipment for that thing, why don't we get somebody down on the beach there, etc. But always the incident commander has to be focused on protecting the environment. What can I do now? What is the best approach to this accident? Keep that in mind all the time. And it's also very important for everybody who's leading other units to remind the incident commander about that. And also the incident commander, very often he gets a lot of questions from media. All these types of accidents get a lot of media, and somebody has to answer them, and it is normally the incident commander who has to be in front of the television crew or whatever comes up. So it's very important that he's very fast to appoint an assistant incident commander who actually can run the thing if he's caught up by that, or politicians. And very often you get local politicians who want to protect a harbor or a sandy beach that's important for local business, things like that. But you almost have to be focused on where are the most vulnerable resources, where are the species that you have to protect to sort of minimize the damage. And that is very important for an incident commander, because a lot of things that's happening around in such a big accident, and the normally 24, 48 hours of an accident is sort of chaotic situation where there's a lot of things going on, but it's sort of, we have to have that poster on the wall. everything you do now is actually to protect the environment. So the strategies that's important from an incident commander is always to work on the source. If there's a ship, an oil platform, whatever, try to stop the pollution coming there, because there's always a lot more in the well or in the ship than actually has leaked out in the start. So if you can stop more of that oil from leaking out, that is the most important. Never forget to work on the source. And so you need to get updated information about what is the conditions out in the area that will be influenced by the oil spill. Because most countries have pretty good sensitivity maps that shows areas that you should protect. But as we all know, that changes from season to season. If it's a breeding area for birds, it's important in the spring and early summer. It is not important in the winter time. But we also have big changes from year to year. Big fish stock could spawn in one area that year and another area the next year. So get all the information, get somebody from the environment unit to get park rangers, locals, get contacts, get information on what is the real situation out there. Because if you just base your decisions on the sensitivity maps, you may fail. So it's very important to get people out there with boats, helicopters, whatever, drones, to see what's going on and get information from fishermen, everyone. And the next thing, you need to know everything about the oil that you're handling. What is the chemical properties? Is it toxic? Is it explosive? Is the fumes dangerous for the people who's working with it? Things like that you need to know as fast as possible. And try to get samples of the oil so you can send it to a laboratory and send that with a helicopter to the laboratory. Be sure that somebody's there to pick it up and start analyzing it as soon as possible. We have experienced sometimes we try to send it and it has taken more than 24 hours before it reached the analysts, so they can't actually tell us anything. So we need to do that and be sure that somebody follows that all the way. So sure it's delivered to a lab that can analyze the oil, because then you know, will it disperse naturally? Will it evaporate? Will it stay for a long time? Things like that is very important when you're planning the whole action. And you also need to get very good drift models and use all the information you get from all sources and put that into a very good common operational picture, and try to get some to look in the weather the next day, the next week. Where will this drift? Which areas should we actually protect now? What should we prioritize? You always need to prioritize something. And the incident commander, he needs very good data to make the right decisions. And you also have to look at methods. Should you burn the oil? Should you use dispersant? Should you collect it, pump it into ships? That you have to do. Somebody else going to speak about the net environmental benefit analysis, but you have to see which method is the best for the environment, and that will depend on the situation. There's not a right answer that's general. You have to look at the situation included. And you have also to bring in local knowledge. There are fishermen, there are sea pilots, there are knows a lot of local currents, things that's important for you when you're planning, so you don't put equipment where it doesn't work. Another thing with bringing local people into, we know if it's gone a couple of days, the media are, of course, interviewing local fishermen and that, and it's very important that they have been involved in protecting the environment. They have given their advices and you listen to their advices, because it's very negative when somebody says, I've been fishing this for 50 years and they don't listen to what I say. That is, you can actually do a good job with the operation, but if you lose the whole thing in the media, that could happen with an oil spill accident. That is actually really bad for the whole outcome of the situation. So it's important to also listen, take advice from local knowledge, and of course they also have very important knowledge to bring to the operation. And so after you worked on the sea, it's the beach cleaning. We have experienced that can be going on for 1.5 years, and there are, as you know, other accidents that's been going on much longer. But then it's not so acute anymore, because that you normally start after the oil is not drifting around. You should have protected the most sensitive areas with booms, as you see in the water here. This boom is not to protect, it's actually to collect the oil that they wash off the rocks, so it doesn't drift out to sea again, but you collect it with the boom. But you should always protect the most sensitive areas before the oil hits the area. But after that phase is over, that could be a week, 2 weeks, then it's the beach cleaning. That will go on for years. And then you have to test different methods. You have to see what is the best. And of course, there are methods that will remove the oil, but actually the agent that you use to remove the oil could make more damage to the environment than the oil itself. And that always happens. There's a lot of companies who have some wonderful chemicals they want to sell because they see this big thing going on and think they can make a lot of money, and they come and say, this one removes everything. Why don't you use that? But then you always have to ask them, have you tested for toxicity? Are you sure that you have the papers that's necessary before you can spread that in nature? Things like that. There's different legislations in all countries, but be very skeptical about very strong chemicals because they will normally make more damage than the oil itself. And you always have to test out methods, because one method can work very well in one sort of beach, on a gravel beach, but it won't work on one bedrock or big pebbles, things like that, or sandy beach, or not to speak about mud flats. So you have to use different methods, and they also change during the year. It may work very well in the summer, but not in the winter, because the temperatures has changed, how the sand, for instance, could be much more heavy and wet in the wintertime, while it's dry and blowing around in summertime. So those are, so you have to test, and you have to test in different seasons. So everything that comes up, and you also have to dedicate somebody to take all these proposals that turns up, because some of them are good, some of them can't actually show that it's environmentally friendly enough to use, but you have to handle them, because they will also go to the media if they say, I have this wonderful chemical agents or methods, and they're not interested in listening to me at all. So you have to channel all those people. So you have to have some people who take care of all these, because that could also disturb your operation if the media suddenly focus on those things that they're not interested in these wonderful methods. This is just to see how different beach cleaning agents are testing out in the lab. When we get the sample of the oil, we send it to the lab, and we see that some work much better than other ones. And then we use that on fresh oil, weathered oil, different ones, so we can advise that, and that's what we're using. Then we only use agents that has been tested and approved before. And at the end, it's always a discussion of how clean is clean, how much should we clean the beaches. And that it's very important that everybody who has a stockholder or has something to do with the area, they should actually be there and see how it is when it's polluted. We should agree upon how much we should clean before we say it's clean. Because if you didn't see the area when it was very polluted and you come back, you will always see some oil there. And you should also test different methods on different types of land. And the pictures here just show that actually in grassland, after a year, all the oil was gone. It worked more like a fertilizer there, but on the hand there holding a stick with running oil on, that has been there for 1.5 years. It's just a thin surface on the oil. and down it's like fresh. So on bedrock you have to move it, but maybe on sand you don't have to do anything, etc. So it's very important to know quite a bit about that. The best is to know it on forehand, but also to test during, because you are working for years with this. So, but the most important thing is that the locals, the different government agency, everybody, they should be there and see when it's very polluted. They should agree upon how much you should clean, because there will always be a discussion, is this clean enough? So, and to set those is very different. But you have to make these decisions about how clean should we actually clean this area, because you could clean forever almost everywhere, but you have to agree upon that, and that is very important. Thank you. I think that's a very brief going through from an incident commander's point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Rune. And indeed, like, we're very lucky to, in fact, have the National Incident Commander of Norway sharing your perspectives and experience on this. So I hope we will have a lot of questions at the end. So looking forward to that. And it's great that you are starting to also emphasize, like, what are the things, what are all the other considerations in addition to environment that an incident commander has to actually think about and manage, including the media, including public communications and perception. So I think these are all important to remember, that it's, while of course we're all focused on the environmental considerations, there are so many other factors that an incident commander has to take into account. So thank you. I will then turn to our second speaker from ITOPF, Dr. Conor Bolas, who is a technical advisor at ITOPF since 2019. His main job is to provide science-based advice on the response to ship source pollution incidents around the world. He has attended already significant spills stemming from Brazil in 2019, the Wakasho in 2020, and most recently the Express Pearl. And actually, one of the things that we've invited ITOPF to share with us is, their perspectives and experience, as they are sort of first responders on regarding emerging trends and emerging risks that they are seeing in this space, in the marine coastal environment. And he will draw primarily from his experiences from the Express Pearl incident and probably from others, and to really look at some of the environmental implications of some of these more complex acute pollution incidents, and his own perspective of how we will be facing more of these type of incidents in the future. So Conor, please go ahead. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Marisol. I'm just trying to share my screen now. Do I need to be sent the link? How do I share my screen? Apologies.
Yes, please, have you opened it already? You are a presenter, so just try sharing it.
Ah, there we go. There we go.
Okay, we see your screen. Great. You will have to go on display settings, Conor. So click, because I think you're on two screens. So yes, go to display settings. Move your mouse to display settings on the top bar. It's called display settings.
Oh, apologies. Display settings.
Next to show taskbar, display settings, and slideshow in the top part of your screen.
Ah.
Do you see? Yes. So do a drop. Click on that. Click on display settings.
I can't see display settings. I'm sorry.
No, you're there. There it is. There it is. Yeah, I see your cursor is there. Your cursor is already on. Okay, you have to. Okay, so it's on the top bar.
Sorry.
Yeah, there. So,
oh, I'm really sorry.
You have to do the drop. Call on the drop bar for the display settings.
I'm really sorry. I can't see display settings anywhere.
Okay.
Maybe you should go off and come and try and share again and see if you'll be able to. Yes, so share again if you see the display. It's at the middle.
So at the top, very top part of your screen.
Yes, I
Very
can see
top.
everyone, webcams, and screenshot.
Yes.
That's
Okay,
what I
click
can see.
there.
Yes.
Click on. Okay, no, I don't think he's seeing it. Click there now. Your cursor's on the right spot.
Yeah, I'm clicking on it. This says everyone. I can click view everyone, view who's talking, view presenter, hide webcams.
Hold on. You're looking at a different screen,
Yeah.
it seems. Okay, this is what we will do. I will ask Bernice to then show your screen of Conor's, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll stop making you presenter, and Bernice will present her screen, and you will just talk her through it.
Okay, sure.
So Bernice, please go ahead.
Okay. All right.
I found it actually.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. This is cutting into my time massively.
That's fine.
No problem. Okay,
Is that
perfect. Yeah,
it's working now?
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
working now. Yeah, we see it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank goodness for that. Okay. So yeah, apologies for that little technical glitch there. Thank you for that introduction, Marisol. My name is Conor. I work at ITOPF, and apologies if you're expecting Susanna Domile to present, but she unfortunately had to attend an incident and travel at short notice, so I'm here to take over for her. So we're going to be talking about the environmental impact and challenges related to oil spills, some of the particular considerations we need to think about for incidents other than oil. So you may be slightly surprised to know that there are only 5,500 container ships operating across the globe today. Doesn't sound like a very big number, but when you think about the combined capacity they have of 24.6 million TEU, TEU is the unit of shipping. It's a 20-foot container, and 24.6 million 20-foot containers is a lot of cargo being shipped around the world. Here we go. And as Marisol rightly says, these kind of incidents are much more complicated because unlike the established response we have to oil spills, which we understand very well, the variety of cargo on ships can range from dangerous goods to household items to anything you can think of, basically. So it's pretty difficult to predict what kind of considerations might be needed in these kinds of incidents. But there is one type of cargo which is increasingly catching more attention. And this is nurdles. So this is the feedstock of the plastics industry. Each one weighs approximately 20 milligrams. They're about 2 millimeters in diameter. And just to help you visualize, in a 1 liter bottle, that is made from about 1,000 nurdles. And when you think that the estimates for production of bottles around the planet is about 400 billion bottles, that's a lot of nurdles to be shipped around the world. Here we go. And it's worth noting that it's not only plastic bottles that are used for nurdles, but also anything made of plastic that we use in our daily life. So you can imagine that this is shipped in very large quantities, but thankfully the majority of it makes it to its destination. But unfortunately, last year there was an incident. It was the Express Pearl incident. Nice animation here. So the vessel caught fire, and the vessel was carrying 422 containers of nurdles off the coast of Colombo in Sri Lanka. Most of the cargo burnt up, but a significant amount of nurdles made their way to Sri Lanka's shoreline. So this was not the first incident of nurdles, but it was by far the biggest. So as a technical advisory service, we at ITOPF, we've been involved in 6 sizable incidents of nurdles. and Rune will probably be familiar with the Trans-Carrier incident in Norway in 2020. So we've been there at 6 of the 8 known incidents. So the incident in Sri Lanka, this was last year, May 2021. We travelled to Sri Lanka to support the government, the people impacted, the ship owner and the insurer, advising on how to respond in the most effective way to reduce impact to the environment, but also to people's livelihoods. We worked very closely with all the stakeholders on site, but in particular MIPA, the Marine Environmental Protection Agency in Sri Lanka. The ship was in a rather unfortunate position. It was positioned exactly so that the current splits, so the nurdles spread north and south across the west coast of Sri Lanka, and the monsoonal winds increased that distribution quite significantly. And I'll talk about that map in a second. So at the closest point to the release, they were washing up in very large quantities, and then further north and south, you can see that the nurdles washing up were somewhat a thinner band, but over a very, very long area, over 300 kilometers. And due to the mobility of the nurdles and the varying levels of concentration, the contamination needs to be understood as fast as possible. So one of the first things that we did was make a surveying app that people could use on their phone, so the authorities and other stakeholders, like the contractor, OSRL, who were also on site, could map the nurdles and allow us to prioritize the cleanup. And just with oil, prioritizing which site should be cleaned first is one of the major considerations. So what else do we think about? There are several factors. Firstly, the behavior of the pollutant. As I mentioned, these nurdles are highly mobile. So not only do they remobilize at high tides, but they also become very quickly buried in sediment. So the speed at which you collect them at the start, when they're very easy to collect, is very, very important. You've got to think about where in the environment the pollutant is going to have the biggest impact. So unlike oil spills, the impact from nurdles is not as well understood or researched. And there's lots of big questions surrounding how the toxicity of nurdles, particularly in this case because of the fire, would affect the environment. What we do know from research is that many marine species ingest plastic items, so they eat the nurdles. But to what extent is still very much unknown. During the incident in Norway, 2020, there was a study of eider ducks, where 50 ducks were taken and they were examined to see if they had ingested any nurdles. And of those 50 birds, only 2 nurdles were found. So actually the impact wasn't as severe as people feared. But we do know that the amenity of the beaches could be affected. So this is more for the sort of the visual pollution. So just like an oil spill, a beach used by tourists or in front of a hotel, it may be a priority to get that beach cleaned up sooner for leisure purposes. Of course, resources, you're limited by the amount of resources you have. This is both equipment and manpower, and in particular for nurdles, manpower is very important. Safety of the workers is also very important, of course, and in Sri Lanka in 2021, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, this was a particular consideration. And then at the end of the cycle, you've got the waste disposal as well, which of course can be a bottleneck. And without a very good waste management plan in your contingency plan, you can actually delay the cleanup operation somewhat. So what approach was taken in this incident? So at first, we had pitches like this, where the highest levels of concentration, of course, were tackled first, where it was very easy to collect it, and you just shoveled it up, even using JCBs and big equipment like that, into waste storage. So that was fairly straightforward. However, as the nurdles had more time to move around, they became more dispersed. And the techniques then needed to change because you don't want to collect too much sand and too much organic debris. Because the amount of waste you collect increases, which is logistically quite difficult, but also because that sand and that organic debris, that's a part of the habitat of the beach, and you don't want to change that habitat and have that negative effect on the beach environment. So, as I said, we needed to change our technique based on what the beach was. We were looking at fishing ports, fishing areas, tourist beaches, and one of the big factors we had to think about was the level of background plastic, which sadly is quite a big problem on the west coast of Sri Lanka. But with our survey data, we were able to prioritize which species should be collected, and we were able to act effectively. But as this was a pretty novel event, a nodal spill, compared to oil spills, we had to look at thinking outside of the box. So we tried a range of mechanical equipment. This machine is called a Beach-Tech Sweepy. So it looks quite good. And again, for PR reasons, it looks effective. But actually, practically speaking, it wasn't that effective. And it was only really useful in very specific circumstances when the beach was flat and free of debris, which is not actually that common in Sri Lanka. The big brother of that machine is the Beach-Tech 2000. Which we actually found was even less selective. So we unfortunately couldn't use this to its full potential, despite lots of trial and error. We used vacuum backpacks as well, which had a use in specific locations. We commissioned the construction of lots of manual trommels. So these are rotating sieves that separate out nodules from sand from larger debris. And then we had mechanical trommels that turned the drum with a diesel engine as well. But at the end of the day, actually, the most effective technique for removing the nodules from the shoreline is to use personnel with sieves. It looks very basic, but actually it's very effective because you're able to target specific locations very easily, any location you want, it doesn't matter what type of beach it is. And you're able to be selective and not collect too much sand or debris. So it's very straightforward. The nodules stay in the sieve, the sand falls through, and then after that stage, we have a flotation tank where the shells that you inevitably collect, they drop out of the mixture and sink. And you end up with a pure product, well, almost pure product that looks a bit like that, which can go for recycling or any sort of processing or other waste management techniques. So talking about sensitive environment, the mangroves were a really big concern in Sri Lanka, actually, because, well, background plastic in Sri Lanka is a very big problem. And of course, the mangroves act as a sort of natural collection site anyway. So a lot of nodules ended up there. And again, we were asking questions with the authorities there about, that net environment benefit analysis. So basically, can we clean up these nodules effectively without causing more damage to the environment? Of course, things like cutting mangrove roots, shoveling up sediment, things like that can be quite damaging to these environments. So this was one of the big discussions that we had on site. And we spent lots of time on site experimenting with different techniques, different tools. In some places, we were able to collect quite a lot, but in most cases, actually, the most effective measure was, in fact, to leave the light contamination areas alone. So this incident is ongoing as of today, 483 days and counting. It's pretty tedious, and the beaches that we have cleaned have been recontaminated by the mobile plastic many times. And although endpoints are being discussed at this stage, it's impossible to tell how long it will continue for. And what are we doing as an international community to tackle this problem? So there are a range of different working groups being put together to address this. The International Group of P&I Clubs have got a working group discussing, in particular, the transport of nodules at sea, whether they can be transported as a different form, perhaps sheets or perhaps like a kind of spaghetti kind of form, and how the containers are stored on ships. But inevitably, accidents will still happen. It's a sad fact. So there are other working groups of different contractors and other agencies looking at response guidelines, so what to do when there is a spill. And then finally, there is lots of research and development ongoing about the impact of plastics on the environment, and what kind of the implications might be of a big spill of nodules in the future. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and hopefully at the end of this session, I'll have a few questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Conor. We will take questions later, but don't move away first, because there was just a very quick question on the question box. Oh, don't close your presentation.
Okay,
There was just a quick question from the clarification question on the question box on slide 27. Just to clarify the different color pins or points.
Yeah, so yeah, it's very straightforward. It's actually, apologies, there should be a little key there. The red is the high contamination, orange is medium contamination, yellow is low, green is very low, and the white dots are no nurdles present.
Okay, great. So just a quick question of clarification. We'll take further questions later. So we'll move on to our third speaker. Thank you, Conor. It's Dr. Paul Krause. He has been a speaker in our webinar series before, so welcome back again, Paul. Paul is an internationally recognized marine ecology and toxicology expert, especially in the oil and gas industry. He has expertise that revolves around marine ecological issues related to new projects being developed and decommissioning. He is currently a partner with ERM Ramboll, based in Los Angeles, and he has a background in marine biology from the California State University and has a doctor's degree from the University of California. So welcome, Paul. Paul is going to focus now on another very interesting aspect, and I think you've heard our two speakers refer to it, which are some of the methods, the environmental sort of assessment tools or methods we have to assess the environmental considerations to help inform your different oil spill response options. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, great. Just to confirm, you guys can see the screen?
I can see your screen. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again. As Marisol said, I'm a principal here at Ramboll, and I'm speaking to you today from Boston, Massachusetts, on the East Coast of the United States. We've heard a little bit from the first two speakers about the incident command center section, and then how to clean up some of these different kinds of spills, like the nurdles. Both speakers referred to things like the methodologies to determine which way you will get the least impact, and both referred to the net environmental benefit analysis. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk today is sort of how do you determine what that best response is, and then how do you minimize the impacts for the response. So there's two separate kinds of questions. We do that in two different ways, with an analytical method called net environmental benefit analysis, or NEBA. And then to look at the minimization of the impacts, there's a new methodology that's out that I want to talk about called the Spill Impact Mitigation Assessment, or SEMA. They're both very related, and I'll go through the difference is there. And I'm going to show you a little bit from some of the case studies of how we've utilized these two different techniques. One from a pipeline spill in California, and one from a ship grounding in Mauritius. So let's talk first about the net environmental benefit analysis. This was a system that's been around for quite a while. It was first used during the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska back in 1990 to look at the different methodologies for cleaning the oil off the rocks. And the questions came up during that spill: how do you best take oil off the rocks without doing further environmental damage? That worked well enough that in 2003, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, here in the US, developed an actual US national framework for this thing and promulgated it into a methodology to be used for spills. Since then, the regulatory agencies here in the United States and many around the world have used this to evaluate different kinds of alternatives, including oil spill cleanup, which we use in there, site restoration. So what do you do after the spill, and how do you determine the best way to do site restoration? We've expanded it into asking questions about contaminated sites and decommissioning activities, which we spoke about on one of the previous webinars. And then in 2016, IPICA developed a guidance manual for using NEBA in spill response. And you can find that manual at the website here, ipica.org. This is a copy of the cover sheet for that. And this will go through all the general methodologies that you're going to need to get to NEBA. But I want to talk a little bit about what those are and what NEBA is and what NEBA is not. So NEBA in its purest form is a net environmental benefit analysis. So the environmental is the real key piece. It's a methodology for identifying and comparing those environmental benefits from an alternative management option or approach. It does not take into account non-environmental aspects of the project, such as cost or safety or social or stakeholder issues. There are other comparative assessment approaches out there that utilize NEBA to answer the environmental question when it's a broader question of cost and safety and stakeholder issues. NEBA then provides the environmental managers, the incident commanders, and the responsive personnel with an understanding of the environmentally superior project perspective, irrespective of these other considerations. If you're familiar with a BPEO, or best practical environmental option analysis, NEBA is not a substitute for BPEOs. What it can do is it can inform the BPEO, and oftentimes we see during a spill people wanting to use the BPEO option analysis program. The NEBA is essentially the E portion of the BPEO. And then basically what happens is you generate the project net environmental benefit, which is defined as the difference between the environmental gains and the environmental losses. So that the gains or the impacts in an environmental service or project. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the technical definitions of what goes into a NEBA. And we generally run NEBAs on an environmental metric or an environmental service, ecological service metric. So the ecological service is basically defined as that environmental aspect of the project that you're caring about, whether that's fish production or benthic habitat value or something along those lines. The actual service metric is the mathematical value that's provided to that. So we tend to run everything on a scale of time on the x-axis and value on the y-axis. The baseline is the condition that the project started before there was any kind of an impact, before there was a spill, before there was a release, or before any other kind of impact. Then we look at the actual amount of the impact. What happens to the spill? What is it going to do to that baseline? How much is it decreasing from the baseline? Everything below the baseline is the impact. Then once we know what the maximum level of impact is, this is the most important part of the NEBA, is the recovery. So we want to know how long will it take from the maximum impact till we get to the maximum level of recovery or maximum benefit. And the benefit is simply everything above the baseline. Oftentimes when you do a cleanup, when you do a spill response, when you do a different type of methodology, you can generate a benefit from the project as well. We saw that in one of the first sets of slides where oil on a grassland actually could give you, leaving some of that there can actually give you a bit of a benefit, because it does act to help the habitat come back. There's a post-recovery period. Once you reach your maximum gain, there's a post-recovery period where sometimes that'll then go back down to the baseline, sometimes it won't, but you need to kind of know what that post-recovery timeline is. So we look at everything from the time to make maximum benefit and the time in the post-recovery period. Calculated all out, and the service loss is everything below the baseline in red, and the service gain is everything above the baseline in green. And then the net environmental benefit is simply the difference in those two. So what kind of data do you need to go into the NEBA? You have to understand the response technology that you're looking for. So you're looking at the different options. Oftentimes we'll come in and they'll ask, I've got 5 different methodologies for how I'm going to clean this beach. which is going to give me the best environmental benefit. So we have to know what those are. Is it booming? Is it skimming? Is it burning? Is it use of dispersants? Is it use of hot water? The different kinds of technologies that can be used. Some are specific to oil on water. Some are specific to oil on land and in wetlands. Hot waters and steam washing often are very effective for getting things off of the rocks, but as Rune pointed out, you can do more environmental damage sometime with that than without. The use of dispersants often helps. It breaks up the oil and it makes it move, and once it moves out into the water, then you can remove it that way. Manually scraping, we see that a lot. If you're getting down into, you have to sometimes manually scrape off the oil. Again, there's damage that can be done to specific kinds of rocks and environmental damage that can be done from scraping. We need to understand what the different receptors are. What environmental service metric are we looking at? Are we looking at birds? Are we concerned more about fish? Are we concerned more about reptiles, mammals? Marine mammals are particularly important. Marine plants in certain parts of the world. Here in California, we have very large kelp forests, so we're always concerned about marine plants. And then what services are we actually interested in? Is it the water quality, the sediment quality, the fish production, how many new baby fish are being produced, or what kind of habitats are out there for birds or for the benthic organisms? We put all that into that model for each one of those, and then we calculate out a net benefit score for each one. So this is an example of results from a project that we did where we looked at 6 different methodologies for cleaning oil off of rocks. And we looked at high pressure water washing, so just steam cleaning, essentially, high pressure wash. Then we used high pressure with hot water. And then we looked at hand scrubbing with a dispersant. So using a dispersant and just scrubbing the rocks by hand to try to get the oil off. Hand scrubbing with tools without the dispersant. And we looked at the low pressure water wash with a dispersant added to the water, and a low pressure water wash without the dispersant. And what we came up with is that you can calculate out the mean weighted net benefit scores. And essentially, the higher the benefit score, the better the environmental benefit is going to be. And in this one, it gives you a very clear way to rank all of these out. And this particular incident, the low pressure water wash with a dispersant provided the best environmental benefit, followed by a low pressure water wash without the dispersant. And you can see sort of how the rest of these ranked out. The worst one was a high pressure hot water wash that basically blasted everything off the rocks. We've used that in a lot of different situations, and I want to tell you a little bit about one of the situations that we had here. Oops, I just lost my presentation. There we go. So back in May of 2015, in Santa Barbara, California, we had a pipeline break. It was a buried pipeline. It was 61 centimeters in diameter. It broke underground, actually on shore. So it actually broke up here on shore. So it was a pipeline that was buried. Nobody really gave it that much consideration, but the oil that spilled out quickly found its way to a storm drain. And that storm drain took the oil from the land side straight into the ocean. And nobody knew that the spill had occurred until it started to hit the ocean. And once it got into the water, there was a fairly large release. About 3,400 barrels of oil was released into the ocean, and it oiled a variety of different kinds of habitats. There were sandy beaches, these cobblestone beaches. There were marine subtidal areas, and some very important culturally sensitive rocks. So these rocks that you see here on the picture down here are very important rocks for some of the native tribes in California, and those were of particular importance when we needed to clean them off. So in order to determine what's the best methodology to get the oil off the rocks, we performed a NEBA for those particular rocks, and that's the one I just showed you, where the low pressure water wash with a dispersant was a little bit better than getting the oil off without doing any physical damage to the rocks. So not only are you interested in understanding the biological, environmental aspects of the process, you also have to often take into consideration the cultural resources that are there. It's very important to not damage those kinds of resources that are extraordinarily rare and important. And that's where we use the NEBA in that methodology. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about a new methodology that came out in 2017. IPICA published another guidance manual on the mitigation of impacts from spills. So similar to the NEBA was mostly focused on methodologies. This was actually focused on how do you mitigate impacts to spills in relation to that. It's a supplemental guide to the NEBA guidance. So if you go to the IPICA website again, you can download both the CEMA document and the NEBA document, and you'll see how they all fit together. It's basically a process to develop how do you mitigate those damage in itself, and it's a stepwise process. The NEBA is very quantitative. The CEMA can be done in a less quantitative, more qualitative manner to look at this, but it includes many of the similar kinds of steps. It's a 4-step process of the things, and I'm going to show you this slide here. It shows you kind of this 4-step process in the CEMA. The first stage is to evaluate the data. We look at the different kind of response scenarios that we might have. We look at the fate and effects of the product that's out there, whether it's a chemical or it's oil or the fuel of some kind. And we look at the resources at risk. What kind of habitats are there? What kind of biology is out there? The second stage then, after we know the data section, is to look at the prediction of the outcomes. We look at the potential impacts on the resources and the preliminary sort of feasibility of the evaluation. How feasible is it to do these methodologies? Again, in the NEBA, this stage is done at a very quantitative level. In the CEMA process, it's done more of a qualitative level. You're predicting the outcomes without going through the mathematical models that you need in the NEBA. The third stage then, after you've predicted the outcomes, is to sort of balance the trade-offs. You look at the stakeholders, who are the people that are going to be most interested in what the outcome is, and then you give a mitigation score of 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it's like, how best are you going to do it? That's probably the only real analytical quantitative methodology that's used in the CEMA process. Where you balance those trade-offs. Which ones are going to give you a better mitigation than the others? And the fourth one is there really then to choose which option you're going to use. You choose the option based on which is going to give you the best mitigation method. In the document, in the IPICA document, there's a CEMA toolkit that will walk you through the entire process to do that. This is a fairly easy methodology to get through, but it's not as quantitative. So some regulatory agencies require you to have a more quantitative methodology than this CEMA process. So you'll see CEMA used in many places around the world. You'll see NEBA used, and oftentimes you'll see them both used at the same time. So here's a case study on a spill that I worked on. I think Conor worked on this one too. This was the MV Wakashiro, which grounded on the fringing reef in Mauritius. This accident occurred when the ship hit the fringing reef and got stuck on the reef. This was a bulk container ship that was essentially empty when it ran aground. So there was no cargo per se on there, but it was carrying a lot of fuel. Once the ship hit the reef, it started to leak fuel, and recovery efforts were done right away, as Rune pointed out, to get the rest of the fuel off the ship. So most of the fuel was removed from the ship. There was still a small amount left, and on August 6th, the ship broke in two. It was quite heavily damaged when it hit the reef, and it finally broke through it, and it released about 1,000 tons of fuel oil. So fuel oil is a little different than crude oil. It's a little lighter. It travels farther, and in Mauritius, being in the middle of the Indian Ocean and quite warm, the weather conditions were such that the oil traveled quite quickly across that fringing reef and into the main lagoon. Once it entered the lagoon, it impacted a whole different variety of habitat types. So we had impacts to coral reefs, to some of the rocky reefs that were there, the mangroves, and a number of different beaches and different beach types. The entire response was quite hindered by the fact that this happened about 2 months after the COVID pandemic really took hold. And it was very difficult to get people and equipment in and out of Mauritius because of the travel restrictions that had been in place by most of the countries over COVID. And I think the main thing was that the country itself was quite unprepared for the response. There was not a lot of equipment pre-positioned and sort of ready. This was not an incident that anybody had really tried to predict. That big container ships and bulk carriers like that don't come into this harbor. It was quite honestly the ship just ran aground on the reef. And one of the questions that came up when we started to look at this, because we had the oil going on all these different habitat types, was how do you best mitigate for these different kinds of habitats, and how do you attack this spill without doing further damage, and then how do you mitigate for that? And we used SEMA in this process for each one of those. So we actually ran a SEMA for coral reefs, for the rocky reefs, for the beaches and the mangroves. Each of us gave a slightly different methodology that was going to be used for mitigation. But as ITOPF and Conor can attest, the methodologies for cleanup were quite rudimentary on this particular spill because of the remote nature of the island and the lack of the structure within it as it is. I think one of the key lessons from Mauritius and the spill in Santa Barbara was to be prepared for everything. And I think that once you have that developed within your country, you can respond to different kinds of spills, I think, in a more comprehensive manner as we go forward. So that's like some of the key tools, the net environmental benefit analysis and SEMA. I would encourage you to go to the IPECA website and download those documents. And there's a lot of resources that are able to help you with that as you develop those resources within your country. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, and to the rest of the speakers. So we do have a number of questions posted on the question box. So thank you to all of those who have joined us. Just a short, just direct you to the handouts. The presentations are saved as PDF, and you can download them in the handouts section of your dashboard. So take a look at your dashboard and look for handouts, and it should all be there for downloading because people are asking for copies of your presentations. So let me just maybe start again from the top, the earlier questions we received, and I think probably in response to Rune's presentation. Just to clarify, how does the response work? Who actually leads the response? Is it the authorities, the Marine and Coastal Administration, or is it external people who are then called to comment? Perhaps just give us a quick overview of how a response is actually mounted and organized.
Yes, that of course differs from country to country, but in Norway, the NCA, the Norwegian Coastal Administration, has responsibility for handling all large oil spills, actually all acute pollutions on sea and on land. So there will always be one person who's leading that from our body, who's actually the incident commander. So, but of course there are, as I said, politicians around, there are other stakeholders that, because very often the minister would be put on television and say, well, why aren't the preparedness better than that? Why couldn't you do something more to prevent things like that? So there's always something, but in Norway anyway, and in most other countries, it's actually incident commander is in charge of the whole operation. And of course, every discussion the incident commander is based on all the advices, all the information he gets from the organization that's below him, but he has to use that information and sort of, if it's a large spill, there could be thousands of people working. If it's a small spill, there could be 10 or 15. So that organization is growing or decreasing according to how important or how big the oil spill is. But it will always be the incident commander who's responsible for what's done and has to make decisions, because there always has to be one at the top who makes the final decisions. But it's always based on all the information, all the knowledge of the system, and that's why you have to bring so many different stakeholders into the picture.
And I guess it also depends on the level of extent and gravity of the spill, right? I mean, if it's a small spill, generally, does the incident commander get involved, or is that something that the operator can also deal with?
Yeah, that also, in Norway, actually, if it's a smaller spill, there is a responsibility for the municipality. It would normally be the fire department that hands in, and if it's a smaller oil spill, it would be the oil companies who's handling it. So we can say that you're not doing a job that's good enough, and we can say you have to put more resources in. But in the end, we can say that, okay, we will take over that. But that has to be a large spill. So all smaller things, we wouldn't, an incident commander from NCA wouldn't be involved. But we have a duty team and a duty officer that's working 24/7, and they will always ask them and get their plans to see if they're doing what they should, because the polluter is always responsible to act and also for the economic and environmental damage that's done by the accident.
Great. Yeah, it's good that you also bring that up, because there was a question about, you know, who's paying for the cleanup, and in particular, for example, in Sri Lanka, you know, who covers the cost of the cleanup? Maybe Conor, you would like to take that up.
Yeah, sure. So in different cases, there's different ways of doing it, but in most cases where ship source spill, it would be the ship's P&I club that eventually covers the cost. But it would be as compensation. So whatever agency is mandated to oversee the response. So for example, in Sri Lanka, it was NEPA, the Marine Environmental Protection Agency. And then they would later on put a claim into the P&I club, the ship's insurer. But different countries have different mechanisms as well. For example, in Mauritius, the Wakashio incident, that was 2 different contractors. One that was already present in Mauritius and one that was brought in by the ship's insurer, and they put their claims into the P&I club. So that's where money for these incidents usually comes from. It's a different story for pipelines and oil rigs and things. I'm not so familiar with that.
Yeah, I think that's a whole different webinar, is it? On covering the cost and compensation and liability. So we'll see whether we can address that in another webinar. But okay, and then, you know, coming back to you know, doing the assessment process of, you know, what type of options would have the best environmental kind of benefit. So there was a question, Paul, if you can just elaborate further on how, for NEBA, for example, how do you actually calculate? I know you were doing it very quickly because we only give you a very short time. Yeah. But in fact, there is a question of how does the mean weighted net benefit score for each option considered calculated?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I didn't go over it in great detail. There's a couple of different ways to do it. In that IPCA document, it describes the calculations that go into that. But basically, once you know that impact level and relative to the baseline and the time period that that recovery is going to take place, you can calculate what's underneath it. We do that in a couple of different ways. We can use a specific model that would cover what that recovery curve looks like for each of those environmental aspects, whether if it's fish production or bird habitat or benthic habitat. Each one of those recovery curves might be different, so you need to calculate each one of those separately. Or you can take them all, and we do a semi-quantitative methodology where you rank them 1 to 5. And so that makes it a little bit faster. And in spills, the semi-quantitative methodology works very quickly to be able to get those kind of answers, because oftentimes you don't want to go back and say, well, I can figure out what the best method's going to be, but it's going to take a week. You need to have the answers done relatively quickly. So to get those weighted mean net benefit scores, we calculate everything on a scale of 1 to 5. So the impact being the baseline being 0, the maximum impact being a -5, the maximum benefit being a +5. And so we can do that on a semi-quantitative basis, meaning basically you have a scientist that says, I think the impact's going to be a -4, and I think the recovery is going to be a +2, and it's going to take 20 years to get to that +2, or it's going to take 20 days to get to that +2, depending on what your time scale is that you're looking at, and that will give you that calculation. But the actual calculation models are in that IPICA document.
Okay, that's thanks for reminding us as well. So I mean, I think those who are really interested on how this can be used, please refer to the publication, the IPICA publication. But that gives us also kind of a sense of, you know, my follow-up question then is, you know, how much of this can you pre-prepare or think through ahead of time? Or is this something that like you just can't, it has to just be done on the spot, like when a spill happens, and then you get out your NEBA sort of calculation sheet and have to sit down and do it?
No, actually, a lot of this can be done ahead of time. In our webinar series number 2 that we did just a few months ago, we talked about setting those resources at risk maps and the sensitivity map. So knowing what's in the sensitivity map is what kind of habitats I'm trying to protect. I can go in and say, what's the most likely kind of spill in this particular area? Is it going to be crude oil or fuel oil or something? And then I can ask some of those questions. So when I walk into the incident commander's office during a spill, I can say, for this particular beach, under these kind of conditions, we think these are your best options to have. And that way, the incident command team in the center has those tools well ahead of time. And that can all be done pre-planned. Things like the spill that Conor talked about, the nurdles, almost impossible to predict, because those are accidents. The Wakashiro incident was an accident. It happened. Nobody would have probably predicted that there would be an opportunity to have fuel oil inside this lagoon. So those kinds of things, you have to have a team that's ready to answer those kind of questions relatively quickly.
But I guess it's also important to have a team ready who knows how to actually apply these tools right away. So that's also part of the preparedness that people can also start to invest in and start, you know, having familiarity with the tools, so that, you know, applying
I think as like the audience is working to set up their incident command systems and their experts within the countries, it's important to have somebody that has that kind of expertise and knowledge. So to somebody within the environmental section of a regulatory agency would be a good place to start.
Okay, great. So there's another question, and there's a lot of interest on this NEBA versus CEMA tool. So the question is, you know, when does one use NEBA or CEMA, or can they be used interchangeably? And how do you bridge the gap in NEBA of limited or no stakeholder involvement? won't the, so where are stakeholders in this process of calculating the environmental benefits?
Well, two ways. To answer the second question first, the stakeholders will, when we look at the methodology, so that spill in Santa Barbara, we particularly looked at the NEBA because of the stakeholders that were interested in making sure that we protected specific areas. So understanding the stakeholders' interests, is it a fishing village that needs to be protected? Is it an industrial area? Is it a culturally sensitive area? Knowing that, again, in that resources at risk map or environmental sensitivity map, you know that kind of ahead of time. So you kind of reached out to those stakeholders within that. The first part of the question, whether you use SEMA or NEBA, kind of depends on the level of spill response that you've got. If it's a very complicated response, NEBA will often be a better methodology to truly be able to show to the public that we use the best methodology we can. SEMA is a little bit faster to be able to respond to things. And in the situation in Mauritius, where we really didn't have a sensitivity map that was very good, and we didn't really have a pre-positioned idea that there was going to be a fuel oil spill, SEMA came in very handy to be able to answer those questions relatively fast.
Okay, that's interesting. How about Conor? Do you have, I mean, what is your experience in taking into account these environmental considerations in your response toolbox kind of thing?
Sure. Yeah. So just to add to what Paul was saying, there quite often a lot of these decisions form a vast majority of the discussion on site. But something that's quite lucky about spill response and the sort of the spill response industry, if you will, is that a lot of these techniques are very familiar, and they're recognized techniques that can be used under certain circumstances. So in many cases, it doesn't need to be a huge weeks of discussion about what kind of technique to use. We know that on port infrastructure, for example, we can use high pressure washing, whereas we might look to avoid that in a more sensitive, maybe like a limestone rag reef crest or something like that. But quite often these decisions do have to be made quite quickly. For example, in Mauritius, we had the issue of oil patches going onto one of the national park, small islets nearby, and we had to deploy people either to there or to the mangroves nearby, where there was also large amounts of oil. So there was, trying to prioritize the sites there was quite challenging. And in the end, it was the mangroves that won out because that oil was remobilizing and recontaminating other beaches. So it was seen as a priority. Yeah, I mean, these kind of decisions are made constantly in every case. That's for sure. Yeah, quite often mangroves is quite a controversial topic. Quite often it's difficult to decide what the best response technique is. And sometimes leaving the oil in the mangroves feels a bit wrong, but actually in lots of cases, that's, for example, in Brazil in 2019, that was in most cases the preferred route, because the impact of the spill responders in the mangrove swamps is much more negative an impact than a few tar balls, for example.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Paul is also nodding his assent. So maybe there are a few other questions that I think will come back to Rune from his National Incident Commander experience and perspective. Like what, I mean, we've touched on it a little bit, and of course, when we're talking about like environmental issues, of course, the first things that come up are like, fish habitat, biodiversity, and sensitive habitats are like mangroves. But there is one environmental issue that I think everyone touched on that I think it's worth spending some time discussing, is on the waste management side, because that can really also leave behind a even longer lasting impact than some of the immediate environmental impacts of the spill itself. So maybe Rune, from your experience, like, how is waste management? I mean, how important is waste management, and how should countries, really prepare for this and deal with this in such incidents?
It is one of the main and most important issues when you're handling an oil spill, is that you have a very good plan for instance how you don't pollute new areas when you are actually moving what you collected, and you have very good plans for dirty zones, clean zones, how people are getting rid of the dirty equipment, the dirty clothes before they move us, so you don't actually drag oil around in the environment. So you have to have a very good plan and very good control of how people are handling that. And another issue that's very important, that if you say you're handling 1,000 tons of oil, normally you end up with 3 times as much waste, because you get wasted seaweed, you get wasted driftwood, you get all these other things that you have to handle. And a lot of that is, according to law, looked upon as dangerous materials. So it's very expensive to handling them. And especially if you are on remote places, it's very costly to transport them to a place that you can handle them. So also to look in ways to in situ handling pollutants or polluted debris, polluted wood. And we have some different projects, but that's very important to see if you can also do a NEBA analysis on what would the cost of transportation. Like we have responsibilities up in the Arctic, if you have to bring polluted seaweed and driftwood down to the mainland and then to special facilities that allow to handle those sort of oils, it's enormously costly. And also the cost for the environment, when you look at how much fuel you're using to ship, transport it, how much CO2 is emissions to the air, things like that. You have to look at that whole picture. So it is also a very important part of it to do all analyze and see what is the best way of handling it. And you get a lot of waste that you have to handle. So you both have to have strict regulation for the people who's working and how they're handling the waste so they don't pollute new areas. And also the cost of handling you have to look into, because it's one of the major costs in oil spill operation.
Great, yes. And I guess also, I mean, like Paul, would you agree that in selecting some of these, I mean, and Conor as well, in selecting some of these response strategies, one consideration is, how much waste will be generated as well from using particular response options, right? So I think that's also something that really we have to take into account, and it should be part of your contingency plans from the start, so that you're not scrambling when an incident actually occurs. We're nearly nearing the end of our discussion, but let me I can take probably 1 or 2 more questions from the question box, and we have several. So here it is about, the question about how clean is clean. We always get this question, and how do we scale down the recovery efforts and resources once an area has been treated? So maybe we'll go around the room and get your perspective on this. So let me start with Paul. How about start with you?
Okay, well, I think that the question of how clean is the age-old question. As a toxicologist, I tend to look at things related to the final ecological risk, and the level of impact and the level of cleanup needs to be, in my view, to the level where you're no longer going to have an ecological impact or an ecological risk. Leaving some of the oil behind, you can never take it down to zero. So leaving some behind is okay, as long as you're leaving it in an area where you've determined that there's no further ecological risk.
Thanks. Conor?
Yeah, so further to the sort of ecological risk, there's also the use of the beach in terms of its amenity value. Just by way of an example, in Mauritius, there were some remote areas of mangroves where the traces of oil remained and it was impractical to collect it all, and the sort of impact of that was deduced to be not so much to merit a response, whereas in front of some of the resort hotels, there was very, very, very thorough cleaning indeed. Obviously, there's tourists swimming on the beach there, and there's health implications, and again that visual pollution. So I think the amenity value also has to be factored in, as well as the likelihood of as Paul said, the long-lasting impact. So, for example, if you have a very heavy oil, you might want to exert more energy in collecting that, whereas a very light oil might disperse in the sea much more readily than a heavy oil, and so the impact of that, it'll naturally attenuate over time. Whereas a heavy oil, you might want to adopt more. You want to pursue it a bit harder to make sure that it doesn't persist in the environment for maybe up to tens of years. So that's an important consideration as well. But it's always a key discussion nearing the end of every response. So it is an important point.
Thanks, Rune. Your final thoughts about what is it to scale down?
What we aim for is to sort of see the ecosystem recovery when they sit back, or when they sit in a situation where they actually can recover. But that is very difficult because the ecosystems are so complex. But very often you have to choose some fish stocks, seabirds, and see that actually now they come back, there's food for them, they sort of start to bring back their population again, just to be back to more normal. So it's to get the ecosystem back again. But as I said, it's also very important that you bring the stakeholders early into, so they see the polluted area, because you, as Paul said, you can never clean it totally. There will always be some oil left. So when people see how bad it is in the beginning and they see how much is clean, it's much easier to agree upon the level of cleaning. And I would like to mention, we had this accident with noodles with plastic pellets in Norway some years ago, and I was the incident commander on handling that case too. And there we ended up actually saying more practically that if you can't collect more than half a liter per man per day, 8 working hours, then you should move on to a new site. That sort of was a practice, because there are pellets to find everywhere, because they're globally spread already. So you will never clean, you never get every pebbles. But we said the cost of having one man working one day. And
a round of applause to all of our speakers and panel. And I'd like to thank our team who has been behind the webinar preparations, Bernice, and also, of course, our intern, Marie, who was actually behind the scenes, making sure everything is as smooth as possible. So thanks again. Thank you very much. I'll see you again next year. Bye.
Very much, everyone.
Everybody, cheers.
Thank you.
Bye for now.